Righty guys, welcome this morning. And this is our final, it's week 8 of our David series. We actually kicked off David right at the beginning of lockdown. And so it's been an amazing little journey. 50-something devotionals and 8 Sunday sermons. Like Dove said, next week is Habakkuk. So I kind of felt a little bit of pressure, like today's got to be amazing because you've got to wrap it all up. But I don't feel that pressure. I feel the pressure, but I don't feel the pressure. And so today, I'd like to look at something that's a little bit out the box. I'd like to look at the way that God interacts with David. And what David's legacy looks like, what God is taking David into long term, and what he's promised David, because I think it has a lot to do with us at the moment, where we aren't always able to scope our future so clearly at the moment. God speaks to David very clearly about his future. But I'd like to first of all maybe kick off. You can turn in your Bibles while I kick off to 2 Samuel chapter 7. That's kind of going to be our text for the day today. But while you turn there, while I've been thinking about that this week, maybe it's just because we've been on lockdown and I've been feeling a little bit disconnected from, I'm a Durban boy, so disconnected from the ocean and disconnected from being outside. I got to thinking that people are a lot like fishing spots, if you know what I'm saying. So fishing spots, my favorite fishing spot in the whole world is this place called Shark Point. And Shark Point is one of those things that separates the men from the boys. When you get there to this fishing point, it's down on the Wild Coast. You have to walk up this mountain, and then you have to go down a mountain to get to it. It's like 45 degrees down the grass, so you go down in your butt. And then you come around a corner, and there's this little thin steel bridge that goes over this chasm. And there's sharks and squid and everything in that chasm waiting to eat you. And so the brave people just walk across, like the locals, they just trot across, and I usually go across on my butt a little bit. But the thing about Shark Point, the thing I love so much about it is, even though it's terrifying to go there, I've had some of the most amazing days of my life there. You know, fishing, catching fish, hanging out with friends. It's really isolated and it's the middle of nowhere. It's like this little piece of heaven. But also it's the place where people have been washed out to sea. And last time we were there, a mate of mine, Robbie, got picked up and ground. I think I mentioned it a couple of weeks ago. He got ground over the rocks, sort of like a cheese grater, and he's still got the scars on his legs. It like absolutely mashed him up. And the thing is, when I say people are like fishing spots, it's very easy for us to stick people into, we turn them into cartoon characters. People are either completely horrible or they're completely amazing. And we don't realize that actually no one's the devil and no one's Jesus. We're all a bit of a mix of the two. My wife Cindy can be completely amazing and just awesome, and she's looking at me at the moment with the eyes that also tell me that she can be terrifying if I leave the house looking like a bomb site at the moment, or leave stuff all over the kitchen like I shouldn't be doing. No one is the devil, no one is Jesus. And I think for all of us, there's this kind of thing built inside of us where we are looking for this ideal relationship. I don't know how else to explain it. We're looking for that perfect relationship in our life where I'll never be let down. You know, Rick Astley, never gonna give you up, never gonna, you know that guy? Like, we're all looking for that guy. We're looking for that relationship where I'm never going to be disappointed. I'm never going to be hurt, that I can completely commit to this relationship. And what's so cool is that relationship does exist. And we see that in today's text. In Psalm 103, David writing, he says this from verse 1. He says, "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless his holy name. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all his benefits, who forgives all our iniquities, who heals all our diseases, who redeems your life from the pit, who crowns you with steadfast love and mercy, who satisfies you with good, so that your youth is renewed like the eagles." And it's such a beautiful picture that there is this relationship that we can have that is completely flawless, and we can have it this side of the grave. People tend to be a little bit up and down, obviously, and it's a little bit tricky in our relationships with people, not everyone's perfect. But in God, we have this absolute perfection of relationship. And that's kind of what our text deals with today. So I thought a little bit just up front, I was wondering if God is this perfect relationship to us, and if he is able to be this relationship to us, be this God to us that he says he is, who is informing our view of him? Because it's very easy. I think if I had to ask this question, who is God? What is God like to you? How does he treat you? And in what tone of voice does he speak to you? I think those are interesting questions. It would be very easy for me to ask those questions of a human relationship. But to ask those of our relationship with God might seem a little bit out there or a little bit different. And so what I did was I popped onto Facebook and I typed in God, and then I just saw what the results were. So these are some of the results. So Cindy's going to pop them up on the TV. So the first one was this. An Indian teen with a tail, he's got some genetic thing, he was worshipped as God. Okay, that's the first one. God of War, PlayStation 4, the final boss fight and ending. Russell Watson, for some reason, wants to know who remembers his sushi salad. He had 8 comments. This popped up. Apparently, God's also wearing a face mask at the moment. Reports of God's death are much exaggerated. That's what it says at the bottom there. And then Kevin Brockmeyer wants to remind us that he thinks we are confusing God with a genie. And so out there, right? But I wonder, and I don't wonder, I know that nowadays, the voices or the flood informing our minds, informing our decisions, informing our worldview is overwhelming, especially now that we're so digital, right? Now that we're so much in the car, not in the car, we're so much online. We wish we were in the car, right? We're so much online at the moment. So we go to online to output, but while we're there, we're also receiving so much input. And so I think there is a place where our view of God, our view of who he is can very easily be informed by Kevin Brockmeyer and, you know, all the other people that are online who's speaking to us about who God is. So if they aren't the people that inform us, we know that we need to go to God's word. And that isn't a mystery to any of us. And today's story, I know I've taken a bit of a time over this intro, but today's story speaks to who God is in such an incredible way. So here's the thing. It starts off in 2 Samuel chapter 7. David's just been crowned king of all of Israel. He was first of all king of Judah, and then the people of Israel come to him and they go, you know, please can you be king of us as well? And David is now king of the whole of Israel. And it's amazing. This is the thing he's been promised since he was a little kid. When Samuel came and anointed him in front of his brothers, and Saul was, you know, he killed Goliath. Saul was trying to pin him to the wall with spears. It's been this long journey, and now all of a sudden, David is the king. He's the guy. The promise that God gave him has come to pass. And so it's from 2 Samuel 7, reading from verse 1, it says, after the king was settled in his palace, and the Lord had given him rest from all of his enemies around him, he said to Nathan the prophet, here I am, living in a house of cedar, while the ark of God remains in a tent. And Nathan replied to the king, whatever you have in mind, go ahead and do it, for the Lord is with you. And so what we see inside of David's heart now, he's just so stoked. He's so grateful to God. He's like, wow, look at everything God has done for me. All the promises, all the stuff that he said he would do, he's done. This is absolutely incredible. But what happens in this moment, and I think this is a great lesson for us to learn, is David's gratefulness gives birth to him wanting to do something. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to do something, but doing something should always happen from the presence of God, right? We shouldn't do something outside of the presence of God. It's very easy to hear God, to feel blessed by God. God provides me, so I'm just going to go and do something without actually realizing I want to go to him first and say, Lord, you know, before I do anything to say thank you, I just want to come to you to say thank you. I want to be in your presence first and foremost. And this is the beginning of a change that begins to happen in David's life, where he isn't so much committed to God's presence as much as he used to be in the journey leading up to this. He now becomes an action man where something happens and he just does his own thing. And when we come back to David 2, the sequel, The Revenge of David, whenever we're going to preach that series later on, we'll see more of that. But something has started to shift here where David just wants to do something. All of a sudden, he wants to put God in a house. And when he was sitting on the hill playing his harp, he didn't care that God was in a tent, a house, whatever. It made no difference to him. He just knew that God could be with him. And because of his influence now, even Nathan the prophet, right, who's the guy who usually calls David in and talks to him about stuff, even Nathan says to him, hey, God's with you. Do whatever you want. Whatever you feel in your heart is good to do. And so our action should happen from the presence of God. That's really, really important from here. And so what God does is he comes to David and he wants to remind him, hey, David, I love you. Just because you're the king, I'm not impressed that you're the king. I still see you as my shepherd boy who is sitting on the hill. I still love you. I'm still as committed to you. There's not a whole lot of pressure on you, David. You don't have to perform for me. You don't have to do a whole bunch of stuff. I still see you as that shepherd boy back then. And he makes 4 promises to David, which are absolutely incredible. So I'd like to look at those. So the first promise that God says, this is after now Nathan has said to David, go and do what you want to do. From verse 4 it says, "But that night the word of the Lord came to Nathan, saying, Go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord says. Are you the one to build me a house to dwell in? I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought the Israelites up out of Egypt to this day. I have been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling. Wherever I have moved with all the Israelites, did I ever say to one of their rulers, whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, why have you not built me a house of cedar?" And that's the big point. But I'm like, but Lord, I want to do something for you, because then at least I feel like sort of I've repaid a bit of the debt, And God's like, there is nothing you can do that can impress me. There is nothing that you can do that can add to who I am at all. What I want you to know is that I am with you. So David comes offering him a house, and God says to him, no, I want you to know that I am with you. You see, because it's so easy for us to find our satisfaction and find our identity in what we do for God. If I do ministry, if I share the gospel with someone, if I have a quiet time, if I do all this stuff, I feel good about myself. Now, there's nothing wrong with doing those things as long as the end result is I want to be with God. I want to be with you, Lord, rather than I want to do these things for you to prove to you how much I love you. Because the problem with trying to do stuff to prove to God that we love him, there's going to be a day when you're going to forget. There's going to be a day when I feel like I've dropped the ball, and now all of a sudden I'm not on that proving to God treadmill anymore. And then I begin to withdraw from God and pull away from him. The thing about Saul, just before David as the king, when I look at Saul's life, I never want to find myself in the position Saul was. Not physical position, and not even his character. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the fact that God had left Saul, and Saul didn't even know. He got so used to living outside of the presence of God that when God was no longer with him, he didn't even realize it. He got so used to doing things of his own volition, of doing stuff for God, doing stuff for himself, such an action man, and not understanding the with God first and foremost, that he completely forgot that point. And I love it when David comes to him and says, I'm going to build you a house. God's like, I don't need a house. I want you. I want your heart. Up till now, I have been with you. God promises in that, and he says, I will continue to be with you, David. And then I wrote this little quote down, which I think is a tweetable quote. You're welcome to pop this wherever you'd like to pop. Put it on your fridge, right? Tattoo it on your arm. The presence of God will always outshine its container. The presence of God will always outshine its container. And so God's like, it doesn't matter if my ark is sitting in a tent. It doesn't matter if it's in a house of cedar. It doesn't matter, wherever you put it, my presence is what's important. The physical thing that carries it isn't important. And we can get so obsessed with the outside of things, the way things look. And God's like, no, it's about presence. I don't want you to build me a house. The point is I want to be with you. And then he goes on to say, that's the first promise he says to David. The second thing in verse 8, he says, now then, he's talking to Nathan, he says, now then, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture, from tending the flock, and I appointed you ruler over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I've cut off all your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth. And this is the thing that God says to David. Firstly, he says to him, I don't need you to build me a house. And secondly, he says to David, I have made you what you are. I have made you what you are. And the point is, I haven't finished with you yet. I'm still at work in you. You are still in process at the moment. And it's such an amazing thing. There were a couple of days this week that were really, really hard for me. And, looking at feeling a bit drained, wanting to, I said, even wanting to run away a little bit and stick my head in the sand. I saw someone tweet a thing, when a cat gets a fright and it runs and hides under the bed, like no one thinks that's weird, but when I want to do it, everyone thinks I've lost my mind. And I had a couple of days like that this week where I just wanted to hide under the bed and just get away. And this has been incredibly comforting for me to realize, but John, God, like he says to David, I saw you first of all out there as the little shepherd boy, and I've brought you every step of the way to where you are. where you are right now, I haven't left you. You haven't achieved anything. You haven't got to any huge heights. You've got to here, and I'm going to continue to keep working in you. I have made you what you are, and I'm still busy making you to be who you are. The God who has worked in me is still at work. The God who is making me hasn't even nearly finished doing what he needs to and wants to do inside of me. And I think there's a huge comfort that comes from that, where I can go to God and go, okay, sometimes I struggle with the process. Other times it's easier for me in the process. But what I do know is that you are committed and you are making something so good, Lord. It's from your presence. And that's the thing God's reminding of David here. Again, David's saying to God, I want to do this for you. And God goes, no, I am doing everything in you and through you. I am at work inside of you. And then after that, he goes on in verse 10. And God says to Nathan, I will provide a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore, as they did at the beginning, and have done ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I will also give you rest from all of your enemies. And it's an incredible promise to David, because he's had to fight so hard. Like he fought the Philistines, then he had to fight Saul, and then he went to live with the Philistines, and then the Amalekites took his family, so he had to fight them. Like David was just running around, like his sword was like pretty much glued to his hand. He's just running around, Mortal Kombat style, just looking for anyone to fight, because there was always someone in front of him to fight. And he becomes the king, and he's like, okay, where's the next fight coming? I'm ready. And God's like, no, I'm going to give you a place, and I'm going to give you peace from your enemies. And friends, this is incredibly comforting for us as well. God speaking to us. The parallel, if you like, is that we need to know that ultimately this earth is not our home. And it just gives us such fresh perspective that Jesus promised us when he was talking to the disciples that he's gone ahead of us to prepare a place for us in heaven. Somewhere, just like God promises to David here, that I'm giving you this place, Israel, a place for my people. Jesus says, I've gone to heaven to prepare a place for you. And up there's no more crying, there's no sickness, there's no suffering. That you're able to find this incredible peace and find this incredible joy in the presence of God without all this stuff. Now, that's not to say that this side of the grave we don't get to experience some of that. Of course we get to experience some of the peace and joy. That's what the church is about, this side of the grave. That we have a community, that God says, I have a community for you to be part of, and I will be with you, and I will walk with you. And even though you might face enemies, I can give you victory over these things as long as you keep trusting me. And it's an incredible promise that God comes and says to David, because it allows him to get through stuff. Because when you look at David's life, he does still have battles that he fights, but he wins. And I think the dream of everything being peaceful, everything being awesome, that's the other side of the grave. But this side of the grave, to know that God is with us, to know that we will overcome, to know that God has already won the victory and we're able to walk in that, it brings incredible peace to us. But we don't know that unless we are in his presence. And that's what God's saying to David here. He's like, just before you run off and go do all your stuff, I want you to come into my presence. I want you to know that this is what I want to give towards you. You remember I said just up front, what is God like to you? How does he treat you? In what tone of voice does he speak to you? Isn't this like the most amazing promises? David now all of a sudden is the king. You would think he's got everything he needs. And God's like, no, I haven't even started with you. Let me show you what else I want to give you. And friends, I do think we need a shift in our thinking about who God is a little bit. And then he goes on in verse 11, the Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, with floggings inflicted by human hands. But my love will never be taken from him as I took it from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. And this is so beautiful because God says to him, he's spoken about David's past. He says, I'm working in you and I'm busy changing you. He speaks to David in his presence and he says, I want to be with you. And now he speaks to David's future and he says to him, I will protect your legacy. In fact, something even more incredible is coming. Something even more incredible is coming. The the person he's talking about specifically, he's talking about Solomon, and he says, I will be with Solomon. And the most incredible thing God does, when Solomon becomes king, God comes to him and says, you can have whatever you want. And that baffles my brain, because I'm like, what did Solomon do to deserve that? Solomon did nothing to deserve that. It was a promise that God made to David. And friends, we, in our relationship with Jesus, this is something so incredible to understand. God has promised, and he has this relationship with Jesus. And because we've been adopted into the family, the promises that God has given to Jesus are now ours. And we are able to live in those things as well. It's the most crazy stuff. And the problem is, if I'm like David and want to run out and start doing stuff, I'm going to try and earn those things. But Solomon did absolutely zip. He did nothing. He just walked, I'm the king now. And God comes to him, he's like, whatever you want. Whatever, like, you know, all those things like, if I had R1 million or if I had a bazillion rand, what would I do? Like, this was one of those real life moments. Solomon literally won the cosmic lotto in the biggest sense, the biggest lotto that's ever been won. Solomon wins it. And he makes the right decision. He asks for wisdom. But it's because of a promise that God made to his father David. And this is the most beautiful thing, friends. We too, in our relationship with Jesus, Jesus is called the Son of David, and we too live in that place where we are able to live in the blessings that God, every good and perfect thing that God has given to Christ, right? When Jesus walked this earth, is now available to us through the Holy Spirit. We don't have to go and earn it and try for it and get God's attention and send up smoke signals to try and, hey God, here I am. But I'm able to just, Lord, thank you for these incredible blessings that you've given me. And then obviously also when he says your kingdom will endure forever, he's talking about Jesus coming. And I think that promise to David, I still struggle to wrap my head around it. The fact that God said to David, one day in your line, the Messiah will come. The fact that Jesus was called the Son of David. I mean, the blessing and just the incredible influence that comes with that moment, because David was someone after God's own heart. It shows the heart of God. It shows the fact that he's including us and that he's knitting us into his family and he wants relationship with us. I love the fact that he's dealt with my past, he is with me in my present, and he has my future in his hands. And so then it goes on in verse 17. It says, Nathan reported to David all the words of this entire revelation. David says to Nathan, I'm the king. I'm bummed. God's in a tent. He lives like a hobo. I live in the temple. Like, that's not on. We're going to build him a temple. And Nathan goes, yeah, it sounds like a good idea. The next day, because that night Nathan receives this revelation, he comes to David and he says, hey, I want to tell you some stuff that God's given. I want to tell you about these 4 promises. How much more do you think David would have felt overwhelmed? How much more do you think David would have been like, this God that I'm serving, just when I think he can't outdo himself, just when I think he can't be more generous, he comes and he's like, and that's not all. If you phone now, there's this, and that's not all. If he just keeps loading it on, because we serve this incredibly generous and gracious God who wants to see us succeed because of what he is building, his thing, from his presence. But none of it makes sense unless I'm in his presence, unless I am with him. That's the call. I want to finish off with this. These promises have been so helpful to me. I remember I said just now that I had a couple of days this week where just had some tough conversations with people where guys have been in a tricky space. They haven't always understood stuff. Some guys frustrated and angry. And to be dead honest, I felt probably the reason I felt frustrated was because I felt helpless. Like, what do I have to give to people? How can I help? Because I feel like words sometimes are just words. But then I come to this text and I realize I don't have to give people anything. Jesus is the only one who can give to them. And so my thing is, if I'm in the presence of God, I'm able to take the promises that I've received, freely I've received. Now I can freely give her the promises that I've received from God. I can't offer any of these things to people. I can't offer the fact that I will always be with people. As much as, Cindy and I in this leadership team who lead this church, we want to be there for everyone. We want to help everyone. We don't want to see anyone suffer. We want to see everyone close to Jesus. We want to see every marriage cooking. We want to see their kids thriving. We want to see the gospel being lived out. We want to see the supernatural through everyone. We want to, but we're people. And I can't live that thing out. But Jesus can. The second thing is, I can't be at work inside of people, when sometimes we're wrestling through things in our marriage. Sometimes Cindy points out something that I'm doing wrong, and I know I'm wrong. It irritates me. Like, it really irks me. And then I'm like, you're right and I'm wrong, but don't push it. I need time to go away and process this. And I just go sit there and sulk a little bit and like, "Arr, okay, I'm okay now." And it's hard when we see people in that space. And maybe you find yourself a little bit like that today. You're in a bit of a tricky space. No, there's no people on the earth that can change you, but Jesus can. That's the promise here. Also, the thing about being able to have a place, a safe place, being able to have your enemies dealt with. We would love to be able to deal with all the enemies, whatever the enemies look like, but we can't. We can't, but Jesus can. We can run to him. And lastly, when we look at our future, I think there's a whole bunch of people running around at the moment predicting what the future is going to look like, and it's going to look like this, and this is the new normal, and all this kind of stuff. I'm like, good for you guys, because we're all sort of making this up at the moment, and long-term planning is 2 weeks in advance at the moment. And when we can't see what the future likes, what do we lean into there? Because it can make us feel a bit anxious. In those moments, we can go to Jesus, who has given us a hope and a future. In the line of David, he's promised to look after our legacy. And I find huge strength from that. And I feel now that I can approach people again, and I feel I can have answers for people because of who Jesus is, not because of who I am. This is, friends, the incredible news of the gospel. And I know that this is so simple, but this is the good news of the gospel. That's why the gospel is called the good news, because it's the fact that God himself came to bridge the gap between us and him. He did everything to bridge the gap so that we could have a relationship with him and be in his presence, but not just be in his presence. And then while we're sitting in his presence, he reminds us of everything he's done for us and how much we owe him. And we sit there in his presence on a guilt trip. But like David, he comes into God's presence and God speaks to him through the prophet Nathan. After everything God's done for him, and God just loads on all the other stuff. I want to let you know that I love you. I want to let you know I want to be with you. And so the question that I asked right at the beginning, what is God like to you? How does he treat you? In what tone of voice does he speak to you? Because when I look at this story, I want to know the God of the Bible. I don't want to know the God of Facebook. I don't want to know the God of the little kid who's got the tail and now everyone's praying to him. I want to know the God of the Bible, who is so powerful, who is so incredible, who loves us so much. I want that God to speak to me. I want him to change me. And that doesn't make me passive at all. In fact, I'm even more active now, because now that I know this God, I'm able to live out my faith because I've known him and he's spoken to me. I've got something to be able to give to people. I go from the presence of God himself on behalf of Jesus now, empowered by the Holy Spirit and the mission that he's called us to.
Thank you so much for joining us. You might be asking yourself the question, how can I take this further? Firstly, you can send us your contact details to cindy@centerchurch.co.za, where we can include you in our online connect groups and you can receive our daily devotional. Secondly, you can hop on our website where you can access previous sermons and find out more about who we are at Center Church. Thirdly, if you consider yourself as part of Center Church, we want to thank you so much for your ongoing financial partnership. The banking details are on the website. Thank you so much for joining us and hope you have an amazing Sunday.